Hi, I'm Professor Jan Plamper from the History Department at Goldsmiths, University of London. This video is part of a series of History at Goldsmiths films and live webinars designed for A-level students. The History Department at Goldsmiths is a tight-knit community in the world's culture capital, London, offering a global range of subjects. We're extremely proud of our teaching. We offer creative degrees that tackle topics that you won't find anywhere else. And we can do so because we're at the forefront of research on these topics. If you'd like to know more, if you're considering applying to us for a degree, or if you would like to take part in our live A-level webinars, please click on the links in the description below or contact our admissions tutor, whose email is also in the description below. Now, I know many of you are studying the Russian Revolution. Let me start by asking a simple question. When the February Revolution began, how did people actually first find out that a revolution was going on? You might think through newspapers, but newspapers appear with a time lag. You might think by word of mouth through rumors. And yes, rumors travel faster than newspaper articles. But even before that, people got wind of the revolution through sensory impressions. Through, for instance, the sounds, sights, and smells of discharging rifles. Here's one 1917 voice from Petrograd, the Russian capital at the time. Quote, "Hastily leaving the house, we hurried to the Troitsky Bridge. Here we found a large but orderly crowd listening to the firing and greedily drinking in every bit of news. Boom! Rat-a-tat, tat-a-tat-tat. Who's firing? On whom?" The sound of machine guns was accompanied by the crack of bursting street lamps and shattered shop windows. Later, there was the smell of the burning institutions of Tsarism. Police archives had been set on fire, and now there were flames and columns of smoke. The sense of touch must have been activated as well. One memoirist speaks of half-blackened pages that blow away and scatter on the snow. So it was actually sensory impressions that first announced the end of the old regime and the arrival of a new time, a new world. What I want to do today is take a look at the Russian Revolution from a sensory perspective. So a look at a historical event with truly global ramifications, with a twist, as it were, outside the box, which is something we relish doing at Goldsmiths. Sensory history is a fairly recent subfield in history. For a long time, historians didn't think the senses even had a history. They assumed that historical actors in all times and all places perceived the world through the same five senses we take for granted. If senses figured at all in history writing, it was as spice in the narrative to make the stories historians craft seem more colorful and feel more visceral, as though the reader were present in the past. Well, when you look more closely, you quickly notice that in other time periods people thought of 10 or 3, not 5 senses, and that they valorized these senses very differently, putting touch and smell at the top rather than vision and hearing, as is the case in the modern Western hierarchy of the senses, where the tactile and olfactory senses are considered closer to the body and hence somehow less worthy. Now, back to Russia. Let's quickly remind ourselves of the basic facts, the narrative of the Russian Revolution. After months of strikes and unrest, the First World War functioning as a catalyst, the Russian monarchy imploded in the February Revolution of 1917. The Tsar had to step down. From then on until October, there was a dual power situation, that is, power resided in two competing institutions: the provisional government on the one hand, and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies on the other. In April, Vladimir Lenin returned from exile and convinced his fellow Bolsheviks that they should push forward to a socialist revolution after the bourgeois February Revolution. Other socialist parties in the Soviet interpreted the Marxist stages of history differently and thought that history would now unfold organically, that the socialist revolution would arrive whenever it arrived, and that the revolutionaries should sit back. Lenin's Bolsheviks won. In October, the legitimacy of the provisional government had eroded, and the Bolsheviks were able to best fill the power vacuum that resulted. But their grip on the vast, multi-ethnic, multi-denominational former Russian Empire was far from certain, and it took another 3 years of bloody civil war that they won definitively, and stayed in power until the end of 1991. Now, after the Tsar had abdicated, there was a real blossoming of democratic senses. Shouts of hooray erupted everywhere, accompanied by, to quote a French diplomat, the unforgettable delirium of speechifying to groups at street corners, of ascending the doorsteps of houses and climbing lamp posts. Music heard in the streets also reflected the changes of who was in power. After the February Revolution, the French Marseillaise began to prevail over the Tsarist anthem, God Save the Tsar. As Russia moved to the left, as the Bolsheviks became dominant over the course of 1917, the Socialist International replaced the Marseillaise, which came to embody bourgeois order. But not everything was as linear and smooth after the February Revolution. There were real social clashes that were often also sensory clashes. Class divisions seized on public transportation, bringing people of different social backgrounds into direct contact, sometimes quite literally, as in streetcars. Petrograd's Tauride Palace became the site of a struggle between the two post-February centers of power, the provisional government and the Soviet. The palace now united pre-revolutionary elites with worker and peasant representatives in a single space. No sense more than smell encapsulated the clashes that ensued. The French diplomat Claude Anet remembered seeing Grand Duke Michael, the Tsar's brother, at the Tauride Palace. I recall to mind the last occasion on which I'd seen him, at the Château de Chambly, surrounded by women in low evening gowns with diamonds and pearls. The strong odor of the hall, the mud on the floors, the noisy crowd, the disorder, the revolutionary soldiers with fixed bayonets formed a singular contrast to that elegant scene. And yet, the new sensory impressions, much like any other sensory phenomenon experienced on a regular basis, quickly became an ordinary, everyday occurrence. By October of 1917, in Moscow, quote, the people of the town were themselves surprisingly calm, Alan Monkhouse, a British engineer working in Russia, recorded in his memoir. Quote, even during the bombardment, railways, postal services, and many other public services functioned as usual, and it was not uncommon to see bread queues standing on one side of a square, whilst the other side of the same square was subjected to rifle fire. The October Revolution, seen from a sensory perspective, was actually not a high point. It was more of the same: the gunfire, shattered glass, street fighting, troop transports, blackouts, interrupted telephone service. In fact, it was so much like the February Revolution that Bolsheviks would take massive efforts beginning in the 1920s to ensure it was remembered as the era's defining moment. It could even be argued that a sensory approach offers an additional causal explanation of why the Bolsheviks invested so heavily in overwriting the memory of February as the main break. It took special effort to erase the sensory impressions of February that were deeply embedded in Russia's collective memory, to break the strong link between memory and the senses. The entire revolution saw much public drunkenness, but it was after October that the situation became critical, reaching a pinnacle during the December wine pogroms. There was widespread looting of liquor stores, beer breweries, vodka factories, and Tsarist wine cellars. Muriel Buchanan, the daughter of the British ambassador, was shocked to see what she called scenes of indescribable horror and disgust, with the crowds in some instances scooping up the dirty, wine-stained snow, drinking it out of their hands, fighting with each other over the remains. After several measures were unsuccessful, often because the troops assigned to guard the liquor stores ended up getting inebriated themselves, the Bolshevik city government decided to pour alcohol into the canals of Petrograd. Quote, beginning with the Winter Palace, the Kronstadt sailors went systematically all over the city and finished the booze problem. They poured the wine on the streets or threw it into the canals. The city reeked with stale alcohol. End quote. What's more, around the time of the Russian Revolution, artists and scientists embarked on some of the 20th century's wild experimentation with the human sensorium. Consider this painting by the Cubo-futurist David Burluk, a major artist of the Russian avant-garde. The expectation was that viewers would behold the painting synesthetically, that is, with several fused senses at the same time, that they would see, touch, and hear, feel it. What underpinned this expectation was an overturning of the Western hierarchy of the senses. Remember, vision on top, smell and tactility at the bottom. A valorization of materiality and the material more generally, and ultimately synesthesia. As Vladimir Markov wrote in 1914, quote, the resonance of the colors, the sound of the materials. To this day, historians argue over when the Russian Revolution ended. Some say it ended with Red October in 1917, others with the end of the Civil War in 1921, or the founding of the USSR in 1922. Yet others believe it was only over when Joseph Stalin managed to consolidate his grip on power in 1927. Whatever you believe, from a sensory angle, key aspects of everyday life only changed in the late 1920s. Consider the sounds of religion. By 1928, at the latest, churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques were being destroyed, bells melted, minarets closed, and muezzins sent to the Gulag, the forced labor camps. If before that the rhythm of everyday life was structured by the sound of church bells, these sensory signs of religion now fell silent. So you see, there are many dimensions to the Russian Revolution: political, social, economic, questions of gender and of ethnicity. What a sensory history approach does is add another important dimension to how people really experienced history on the ground. Because being human is not just about thinking, it's also about feeling and sensing. In fact, temporally speaking, it's first and foremost about sensing, as we saw at the beginning of this video, when we wondered how people first became aware of the February Revolution, and learned that it wasn't newspaper headlines or even rumors, but the sounds of bullets and bursting street lamps. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like to think about studying at Goldsmiths. For more on us and our history degrees and on how to get into contact, don't forget to click on the links in the description below. We'd love to hear from you.